Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's AWRI webinar. My name is Robin Dixon, and I'm a senior viticulturist at the AWRI. I'm joining you today from Urbray on Ghana land. In this session, we will look at techniques for resting vineyards. In the spirit of reconciliation, the AWRI acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. This webinar is supported by the Wine Grape Council of South Australia through funding from the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund and the Government of South Australia. This webinar is part of a series of workshops that have been run in 3 regions in South Australia. So before we jump in and make a start, just a quick reminder to anyone who is new to AWRI webinars. So if you'd like to provide a comment or ask a question throughout the session, jump on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the page, click on the Q&A button and type in your question and press submit. You can do that at any time. We'll be holding the Q&A session at the end. Also a reminder that these sessions are recorded and a link will be sent through later with the recording. So for anyone who has just joined us, welcome. Today's topic is techniques for resting vineyards, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Paul Petrie. Paul Petrie is the Principal Scientist for Viticulture and Program Manager of the Irrigated Crops at the South Australian Research and Development Institute. He has extensive experience in the Australian wine industry, including work in research and extension at the AWRI and as the National Viticulturist at Treasury Wine Estates. Paul grew up helping his parents establish a vineyard in New Zealand, and before moving to Australia for a role at CSIRO, he completed a PhD on canopy management at Lincoln University. Paul leads a viticultural research program that aims to improve the resilience of Australian vineyards, increasing their productivity and ability to adapt to climate change. Paul supports a wide range of horticultural projects, including the development of high-density almond orchards and the assessment of the recovery of apples and cherries after bushfire. If you're ready to make a start, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Robin. Okay, so the project on vineyard resting is part of a collaboration between a team based at Sardi, so myself, Marcus Bonada and Gaston Sepulveda, and another team from New South Wales DPI, Katie Dunn and Bruno Holzefeld. We have 2 trial sites, so one site based here in South Australia in the Riverland and another site based at Griffith, but I'll go into those in a little bit more detail shortly. As Robin said, this program has been part of a series of, this webinar is part of a series of, or was built on a series of in-person seminars that we've run across a range of regions in South Australia. As part of these seminars, we've also received a vintage report from Wine Australia. That's been really useful because it's provided a nice introduction or some context into my presentation. And so I'm just going to attempt to summarize that briefly. But if anyone wants more information on this, the vintage report has also been presented as a AWRI webinar, and the link for that will be distributed as part of the follow-up to the session. You can also search for it. There's a picture there on the screen as part of the AWRI's YouTube channel. So the take-home messages from the National Vintage Survey, or the update, the position update, is that internationally wine consumption is decreasing. This is impacting especially on Australian red wines, where we're seeing depressed prices internationally. A very high stock to sales ratio. So basically we have a lot of wine in tank already. This is depressing local prices, and it means that we're unlikely to harvest all the fruit for the 23-24 vintage, so the upcoming vintage. So hence the relevance of the presentation on vineyard resting. Good. So what are we interested in for vineyard resting? We're wanting to basically how to manage a vineyard if we're not expecting to harvest a crop. To do this, we want to reduce inputs. So things like harvest is a very expensive operation. Even harvesting onto the ground is relatively expensive. So if it can be avoided, that is a plus. But in conjunction to this, it would allow us to reduce the number of pesticide applications, the amount of irrigation applied, and generally the number of tractor passes through the vineyard, hence reducing costs. When we first started this program last year, we had relatively little information on the best methods to use for vineyard resting. And because we've really only had one season of work, there are still some caveats that will that come with this technique, especially the carryover the effects, or the effects that the season following resting. The limited information we have used, we've often drew from the dried fruit industry that uses some of these techniques more extensively. So what does the ideal practice look like for vineyard resting? It has to be effective. Obviously, we don't want to harvest fruit, or the yield has to be low enough that there isn't really any fruit there to harvest. It has to align with our current set of practices. So it has to be something that we would normally do. It doesn't need any special equipment. It certainly wouldn't want to need us to bring a contractor in to help, because there'd be additional cash costs with that. Needs to be practical, and it doesn't want to impact on production in the coming season. So basically, we're looking for something that sits right in the middle of that Venn diagram there on the side of the screen. We had a couple trial sites. So we had a site with Chardonnay in Griffith and a site with Shiraz in Renmark. You might ask why we would focus on Chardonnay when the current issue we're seeing within the industry is an oversupply of red grapes. The concept behind the project is that we'll develop a toolbox, something that growers can pick up on and use anytime we have an issue with excess supply. So that may be, as we're seeing at the moment, due to low international wine prices and low prices for our fruit here in Australia, but it could be due to other reasons, such as reduced water allocations after or during a drought, and an increase in water prices that may make production of wine grapes less affordable. So hence we want to have techniques that will work on a range of varieties and not just one or two. In that same context, as we're worried or concerned about irrigation or the irrigation response, as part of these trials, we've also investigated a range of irrigation volumes. So up from about 7 megalitres per hectare. So it's about industry standard for the regions that we're working in, 3.5 megalitres per hectare and 2 megalitres per hectare, to try and get an idea of what sort of potential water savings we can see if we remove the fruit. We're also investigated 3 crop levels that we imposed manually. So by chopping the fruit off, I say we, it wasn't really me, it was a lot of the helpers that ran the trial or managed and oversaw the trial. And they went through and removed sort of 50% or all of the grapes manually, because when we were setting up the trial, we didn't know exactly what technique was going to be the most effective. So we assessed a range of different treatments. We looked at, well, the first one I'm going to talk about is double pruning, or a second pruning. This was imposed at about 80% flowering. And if you're familiar with a machine pruned canopy, the cutter bar will go through and trim the canopy back into effectively a box shape, or to trim it back to fit within a box shape. And when I came back and did the second lot of trimming with the hedge trimmer that you can see there, I basically followed the same boundaries of the box that had been pruned in winter pruning, or during winter pruning. We trialled applying a fertilizer, calcium nitrate. It is can have a burning effect on the canopy. When we first talked about this technique and how effective it might be or how it might look, I was expecting something like a bad frost, or maybe if you had sprayed your vineyard with spray seed as a defoliant. The calcium nitrate didn't have that much of a burning effect. It certainly scorched the edge of the leaves, as you can see in the photo at the bottom, and it burnt some of the inflorescences. But it and checked the canopy growth, or reduced the canopy growth, and you can even see that later in the season, but it didn't burn the whole canopy. So we applied 2 applications of the calcium nitrate, one at about 10 leaves and one at about 80% flowering.
Recording in progress.
We also assessed a range of treatments using Ethephon. So this was Ethephon by itself, or Ethephon in combination, or a double application of Ethephon, or in combination with calcium nitrate. Ethephon is a plant growth regulator. It breaks down to release a gas, ethylene, and it promotes, in this situation, the abscission of the grape berries. That means they fall off effectively. For it to be effective, you have to have grape berries in place. So if you apply it too early in the season, sort of at the up to and during the start of flowering, it doesn't work as well. And likewise, if you apply it after fruit set, the berries become more strongly anchored to the rachis, and it is not as effective. So we looked at it, as I said, in combination with a couple of in combination with calcium nitrate. So the calcium nitrate was applied at 10 leaves, and then the Ethephon was applied at early fruit set, or by itself, just at early fruit set, or if we did 2 applications, one at 80% flowering and again at early fruit set. It was applied in combination with a non-ionic wetting agent. And I want to emphasize that those developmental stages are, or we think they're quite critical for the effectiveness of this as a treatment. We've got some pictures of the Ethephon and what it looks like. I'm not sure how clear those are on your screen, but if I bring up the cursor here, we can see where my cursor is tracing. That's effectively a rachis where all the berries have fallen off. And so it's basically just what was left after the Ethephon application. We come back maybe a week later. So a lot of these rachises would have desiccated and have disappeared. Where this one is still in place, it is still holding some berries, but as we can see, most of those berries are still gone. Another one where a good portion of the rachis is desiccated. When we came back at harvest, there weren't many bunches there, and we'll see that from the yield results, or from this photo over on the side here. But where the bunches were, we could still see that there were some berries missing from those bunches. Okay, so if we look at the results, this is Shiraz in a commercial vineyard, so they're targeting a relatively high yield. In this case, the control was a little bit over 30 tonnes per hectare. When we applied the calcium nitrate, we had a reduction, but it was a significant reduction, but it wasn't a large reduction, so down to a little bit more than 20 tonnes per hectare. But the other management practices, so the ones that included Ethephon and the double pruning, were more effective. The double pruning maybe about 3 tonnes a hectare, and then the ones with Ethephon sort of closer to around 2 tonnes per hectare. I note that while the double pruning was effective, it had quite a negative impact on canopy growth and development. Probably not that surprising. And when we came back and did pruning weights on these, I'm not presenting the pruning weights, but when we came back and did them, that was only sort of 3 or 4 weeks ago, the double pruning treatment had a pruning weight of about half the other treatments. So I'm very nervous about how this is going to perform in this coming season, because the canopy growth and development was quite poor. For the other treatments, the Ethephon appeared to be quite effective at removing the fruit at the Shiraz in Redmart. If we go to the trial site at Griffith, this is a Chardonnay site, as I said earlier. Control had a yield of about 6 tonnes per hectare. Once again, the calcium nitrate wasn't that effective, but the double pruning was, and in this case, really it was only the double application of Ethephon that worked a lot better than the single application, or the application in combination with calcium nitrate. A couple of things to point out here. When we discussed why these single applications of Ethephon weren't as effective, we think it was probably to do a timing thing, that they may have gone on a little bit later than would have been ideal or would have been our target phenological stages. We also note that the yield for this treatment is relatively low, for the control here is relatively low. This is a commercial region and they would expect generally a much higher yield. They had a pretty challenging season at that trial site, as a lot of that region did. And so they had standing water there for, well into the growing season. Hence there were a few pest and disease and other issues there that restricted their yield. We look at bunch number, basically followed very much the same pattern as the yield. So where there were less bunches, there was also a lower yield. So I won't dwell on that for too long. We said that water status was an important component or important factor in this project. So as part of assessing water status, we measured stem water potential. Stem water potential is a measure of how water stressed the vines are. We put the leaves inside a chamber with the PDL sticking out the top, and we apply pressure to that chamber until the sap from inside the leaves squirts out the top of the PDL. The more pressure I have to apply to get that sap to squirt out, the drier the leaves are and the more water stress the vine is. Because we're applying pressure, we use a negative scale. So the more negative the scale is, the more water stressed these vines are. So in this case, if we look across the top here, we've got the 2 megalitres, 3.5 and 7 megalitres per hectare. And the 2 megalitres with the full crop is more stressed than its equivalent treatment with the other ones, with more water. And as we remove the crop, those vines become less stressed. It was consistent across the 3 irrigation rates. If we look at stomatal conductance, so this is another measure of how the water status of the grapevines. So the stomata are the pores underneath the leaves. They regulate photosynthesis, so carbon dioxide in, oxygen out, and they also regulate the loss of water or the transpiration of water from the leaves. So the stomatal conductance for the vines that received the less water, or the Shiraz that received less water, was around 60, 65. For the full crop, so that means less stomatal conductance. The stomata are more closed, so those vines are more stressed compared to the crop removal treatment there. Once again, a range as we, more stomatal conductance where we applied more water, but there was a bit of an interaction. So there was, at the low irrigation rate, the crop removal, the full crop was most stressed, the crop removal was less stressed. Same or similar pattern at the 3.5 megalitres, but when we get to the full irrigation rate, there really wasn't a lot of difference between them. If we look at the Chardonnay at Griffith, as I said, there was some standing water at that trial through a good part of the season, and I think that effectively negated a lot of their irrigation treatments, or the impact of a lot of their irrigation treatments. Okay. So of the treatments that we looked at, Ethephon appeared to be by far the most effective, or likely to be the most effective. If we look at the rough cost of this application, an example of one of the products, and there's quite a number of products in this category, for a 20-litre drum is about $300, a bit over $300. But I say there are a lot of different options. The concentration of this one happens to be about 900 grams per litre. They do come in 700 grams per litre concentrations as well. If we use the full water rate, so 2,000 litres a hectare, as we would for full canopy coverage in the Riverland, it works out at about $35 per hectare for a pass. So we felt generally fairly cost effective. Obviously, there is the cost of the application on top of that. So while we think this is a viable or a strong option, there are quite a few caveats that go with this, or potentially go with this. So say it's a single season, so there's a number of things that we don't know, or we haven't been able to answer through 1 year of trials. For a start, These applications were all made using a full rate, so a full water rate, so the aiming to saturate the entire canopy. The instructions for the dried fruit growers when they're using this technique is once again to apply, use a high water rate, and we're not sure exactly how it will perform if you use it as for concentrate spray. The compatibility, so we know that it is quite pH dependent, so it generally acidifies the active as an acid. It generally acidifies the spray solution, but you have to be careful. If the pH is too high, it doesn't break down as quickly and may not be as effective. We don't know a lot about its compatibility for grapevines. The product, the Ethephon, is used quite a lot in the cotton industry, and my understanding is that the cotton growers apply it in combination with other products and don't see too many issues. But we certainly haven't tried that. And for example, if you were to add it to the tank in combination with an alkali fungicide, they may react even before they start to be diluted by the spray water. So you'd want to be pretty careful with how you went about that. Temperature is quite important. So once again, the temperature drives the breakdown of the Ethephon into ethylene and then for its action to occur. Generally, if the temperatures are quite cool, this breakdown will be slowed down, but they can also be too hot and the breakdown can occur too quickly and sort of before it has an impact or a chance to have an impact on the berries. For the cotton, they talk about a temperature greater than 17 degrees. The dose response and the application window. So we've tried this basically only at this one sort of relatively high application rate, the 1 gram per litre. There were some commercial attempts to use this at a lower rate. So the rate that the dried fruit guys use it at is about 400 milligrams per litre, and they didn't appear to be as effective or effective enough. I don't know what, there may be an optimum figure that's between those, but we don't know what that is. Likewise with the application window, I know that the phenological stage is important, but I don't know exactly how important. Could you go, a few days after fruit set or a week after fruit set? At what time does it become ineffective? So at the moment, our guidelines are stick very carefully to those phenological stages that we advised. But as far as bunch zone application, so for our trial site in the Riverland, because it's machine pruned, this bunch is spread quite a lot or quite well across the canopy, and you would need to apply it to the whole canopy. If you had a spur prune system, it's likely you could target just the bunch zone with the spray if that made sense for your application system. The dried fruit growers, that's how they do their application. So they have a section of the canopy that they're applying the Ethephon to that they don't want to carry a crop in as part of their drying process. Residues, so there's often a lot of questions or concerns about residues. We collected some of the residual fruit and sent that for residue testing. So from the double treatment or the double application of Ethephon, and we did not, or the lab did not detect any residues in that fruit. Also remember that this was fruit that was in the same season as the Ethephon was applied, whereas in the context we're describing, you would wait a further 12 months from when that fruit was harvested before it was delivered to the winery. So we expect the risk of residues to be even less than that. As far as permits for application go, so we had a special use permit at the lower rate, the 400 milligrams per litre during last season. And for this season, we have applied for a special use permit at the higher rate, at the gram per litre. That's been submitted to the AVPMA in the last couple of weeks, and we're still waiting for feedback. But we're fairly optimistic based on the information we've been able to provide that they would approve that. The product already has a permit for application to Similon as a harvest aid at the rate I'm describing, at the 1,000 milligrams per litre. So we're as I said, we're hopeful that we should be able to get a permit. What are our plans for the coming season? So probably the last caveat as well is the carryover effect. So what impact is the Ethephon likely to have on the yield the following season? plant growth regulators, so the sort of broad category of chemicals that the Ethephon sits in, are renowned for mucking up the grapevine reproductive pathway, and so effectively disrupting the development of the inflorescence primordia, or the differentiation and the development of the inflorescence primordia, and then reducing crop for the following year. So that's certainly a risk with this product. The reports that we've seen, and one of the reasons we chose it, is that it appears to be less likely to have this impact compared to something like gibberellic acid. We have our intention, so I have some reports where it's been applied at slightly different rates, so often at slightly lower rates, and where they've come back the following season and they haven't seen an impact on yield. So that gives me hope that it won't impact on yield the following season. And we intend to go out and do some inflorescence counts well pre-flowering. So basically, as soon as the vines are developed enough that we can do that reliably, so we can provide advice back to industry, and you guys can make decisions if you do or don't want to go ahead once you've got that information. We also, so for the coming season, would like to confirm our results, make sure we can run the trial successfully, and do this again. Follow some of the treated vines through to a commercial harvest, and confirm the impact on yield, and try and quantify and better understand the irrigation savings. So at the moment, I can say, look, the vines without the fruit are less water stressed, but I couldn't provide advice to you that would say, look, if you've removed the fruit, you can reduce your irrigation by 20% or by 40% or whatever, and give you sort of a bit more of a figure that would aid your management in that space. Okay, so just finally to acknowledge the staff and the growers that hosted the trial and helped support us with running the trial, and Marcel Essling and Robin Dixon at the AWRI for help around some of the economics, and also for support with the special use permits. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. Now, as part of these resting vineyard workshops that have been held in the regions, we've been working with growers to go through the costs associated with growing a crop, and the costs that can be eliminated by resting a vineyard. And the results that we've come up with in the different regions show that the costs can be reduced by about $2,500 per hectare, regardless of the region. There's a question, Paul, about the crop protection practices for these different trials. And I guess to broaden that question a little bit more, do you have any thoughts on which crop protection sprays can be reduced if you're resting a vineyard, from the feedback we've had from the regions?
Yeah, okay. So I mean, that's I suppose a fairly broad question, and it's going to depend a little bit on the season, the disease pressure, as well as the what practices you're running. I suppose if we've removed some or most of the fruit and you're not expecting to harvest, you would assume that you wouldn't need to worry about any botryticides if they're part of your standard process or your standard program. As for the other ones, so management for powdery and downy mildew. For powdery mildew, if you are trying to manage your canopies to reduce its size, so basically not too much water, depending on what the seasonal conditions are, what the rainfall is like during spring and stuff, you can manage to run those at sort of, I suppose what I would say would be the lower end of your what would be normal in your region. For downy, it's very much going to once again depend on the weather conditions. Also bear in mind that if you're resting one block that's sitting within a vineyard that has other blocks around it that you're looking to harvest, you want to be careful that you're not sort of providing an inoculum source to support the spread of disease across the rest of your site.
Thank you. So other things that we talked about were herbicide applications and your ability to perhaps drop one of those herbicide rounds. You still need to manage weeds, so you don't have an issue in the future, but perhaps reducing one of those herbicide applications. The urea applications can probably be reduced.
Certainly, I think a lot of those fertilizer inputs when we're trying to harvest, take a lot out of the vineyard, we need fertilizers to replace that. If we're not taking that fruit off site, then I think you could safely look to emit a number of those ones.
Yeah, micronutrients, pre-flowering, obviously you wouldn't want to put those on. Pruning costs, can you talk to that at all, Paul? So a strategy to minimize pruning costs?
I mean, if it's a machine prune system, then you probably would, you go, I think certainly the scenarios we've been discussing, you're going ahead with the machine pruning. If you have a spur prune system, your pruning is a lot more expensive to start with. And I suppose it's around minimizing those expenses. As part of the workshops, we've had some quite sort of extensive discussions about what you can get away with and what you can't get away with and how long you can get away with that. But even if you do a mechanical pre-prune, you probably need to have some sort of follow-up to trim around posts and things like that. You couldn't just have that as your only management practice. It also depends on, I think, how quickly you're expecting your vineyard to come back into production. Again, if you mechanically pre-prune the vineyard and pretty much left it when it's been traditionally spur pruned and then wanted to come back in 2 or 3 seasons and try and go back to spur pruning again, that could be quite an expensive exercise.
Okay. Thank you. And just in regards to irrigation, I know you said you couldn't give a recommendation to drop it by a certain percentage, but do you have any advice for growers about managing that?
I would say very much you let your canopy tell you how much water to put on. If you've applied the Ethephon, often the competition between the growing and the ripening grapes and the growing shoots means that the canopy growth stalls in that sort of post fruit set period, and that's generally a pretty good thing. We have to have a good sized canopy by then. If you see any signs that your canopy is starting to grow again, or it is continuing to grow in that post-set period, then I would look very hard at your irrigation and say, look, you're probably putting more on than you need to. And it would be a shame, you're realizing a saving by removing the fruit. It'll be a shame to lose some of that saving because you've had to go through and trim a couple extra times because you're worried about foliar disease incidents or something like that. But I mean, in an ideal world, you'd be able to manage the canopy growth with irrigation once the fruit is removed, so you can avoid those trimming passes, because once again, that's an extra cost that you don't need.
Yep, great, good advice. There's a question: is there an indication of the number of hectares under resting at the moment?
The short answer is probably no. And certainly not many, I think, using the technique I've described here. When we've been doing the workshops, we've had a lot of interest and a lot of comments afterwards about growers that are saying that they're sort of looking to rest some blocks within their vineyards. But I couldn't say there's X hundred or X thousand hectares or whatever. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Another thing we've been discussing in the workshops is the different options available. So we've been talking about reworking, we've been talking about grafting, replanting, and really when you add up the costs associated with those different operations, I feel like the main message is you need to be really sure that you're going to be able to get a contract for a decent amount of money to justify spending that amount of money on doing any of those operations. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think you've captured that pretty well. That effectively, if you are reworking, top working or replanting, those are all very expensive operations, and it may be it may be more sensible to either remove a vineyard and wait and make that decision later, whether you are going to replant, and to have a better idea of what plant variety you might want to replant to, because otherwise with the gross margin model that we were running, it was very hard to demonstrate that that was a very an economically sensible thing to do.
Mm. Another thing that came out of those workshops was that you really need to have a good relationship with your wine company to really understand which varieties they're looking for before you start to replant.
Not something you want to do on spec.
No. Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the audience. So as I mentioned, this webinar has been recorded and it will be sent out to you. We will also send out a link to Sandy Hathaway's webinar on the National Vintage Report, so you can have a look at that at the same time. If you would like more information about the costs associated with the different resting scenarios, so a spreadsheet will be shared via the Wine Grape Council of SA, and we're looking to put the spreadsheet on the AWRI website. So our next webinar is next Thursday, the 24th of August, and it's with Professor Jeff Gurr from Charles Sturt University, and he will present with Dr. Jian Liu. I'm sorry, I should have checked the pronunciation, on using cover crops and landscape features to deliver benefits for wine grape growers. So if you'd like to register for that session, please jump on the AWRI website. Thank you again, Paul, and to the audience. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.